All right. In theory, Mr. Lafontaine, we are live now on the internet. So hello, everyone. Thanks. If there is anyone joining, I'm not entirely sure. YouTube doesn't update me. This is Mr. Luc Lafontaine, and he knows lots of stuff about swords. I asked him to join me on a sword chat, and he obliged. So this is our conversation. But I will let Mr. Lafontaine introduce himself.
Well, Matthew, thanks for having me. It's an honor. I appreciate it. Any chance when people get to cross-reference about information and history and swords is always a good thing. So I really, really appreciate you doing this.
No problem. Could you maybe tell us a little bit about yourself, your background, where people might recognize you from?
Sure. I started in the martial arts at about 9 years old, but I very, very quickly in my teenage years had a nutty affinity for the film industry. And so from a very, very young age, I became an avid film buff while still studying martial arts at the same time. And as I got into my teenage years, I was very, very fortunate that my father was an exhibit designer for the Metropolitan Museum of Art. And he had worked very, very, very hard to work his way up through the ranks of being a conceptual artist and doing a lot of smaller projects and eventually becoming a major exhibit designer for the museum, the Metropolitan Museum of Art. And in a off-sided stroke of luck, my father needed to do something with me because I was driving him insane at the museum because he was getting a call every 3 minutes. Mr. Lafontaine, this is security. Your son is climbing on the arms and armor exhibit again. Can you please come get him? There was a very famous piece in the middle of one of the halls of two knights jousting. So it was full sets of armor, with war horses and lances, and my not knowing any better at my young age, I wanted to get on the horse with the knight. And so I was immediately busted trying to climb up onto the horse, and not knowing any better, got scolded and talked to. And I got to know everyone at the museum very well because I was there all the time. And by the age of around 14, they figured out what to do with me, and they made me at first an unofficial apprentice to the Arms and Armor Department. So they stuck me down in the Arms and Armor Department with a gentleman by the name of Robert Carroll. And Robert at the time was running the Arms and Armor Department in the very early 80s for the Metropolitan Museum of Art. And Robert's specialty was firearms. He was a specialist in matchlocks, wheel locks, splint locks, but he knew that I had a psychotic affinity for swords and armor and weapons. And so he started to take me under his wing along with the other guys and teaching me everything. They would arbitrarily open drawers and go, "What's that?" And I'd say, "It's a 16th century Negroli shield." And they'd say, "What's that?" And I'd say, "It's a German swept-hilt sword." "What's that?" "That's an Italian rapier." And so forth and so on for about the next 4 years. And I was lucky enough to amass tons of knowledge and have access to things that no person my age normally would have had access to. I was probably, in all honesty, one of the first people at my age to have access to the original fencing manuals. To my knowledge, nobody before that point had gotten actual access. At the age of 17, I got access to Agrippa and Capoferro and Angelo through the museum. And I was looking to delve into the texts, and I asked for someone at the museum that could translate period languages. So I needed a translation of period Italian because period Italian and modern Italian are not the same at all. And a lot of the terminology in the fencing manuals was entirely different. So they gave me someone, and they came down, and I started going through Capoferro. And this was in 1980, my God, probably 1985, maybe the end of 84. And at some point, the museum suddenly realized what I was doing and panicked because there was no official paperwork or official decision to allow me to proceed with translating and doing paperwork on a period fencing treatise. And all of a sudden, the museum themselves realized, my God, we should be doing this ourselves. So they immediately pulled the books from me and said that I had to go back about my business and dealing with the Arms and Armor department. The Arms and Armor department were all very, very proud of me for what I was trying to do. But alas, they got wise to it. And years later, they didn't exhibit themselves and did exactly what I was doing and pulled up 5 or 6 fencing treatises and did a very, very mini exhibit in one of the halls on the entire subject. From the Arms and Armor department, when I graduated high school and eventually graduated college, I was determined to get into the film business. And I had done very, very minor projects on the East Coast. I had done all of the stunt coordinating and action for all of the senior film projects at the Rhode Island School of Design for like 2 years in a row. And the reason I got the bug was I was lucky enough that I went to school with the director John Avildsen's son. And he said, well, you've got to be in this movie. My dad's making a martial arts movie and I'm going to get you in it. And I said, okay. And that movie turned out to be the original Karate Kid. So my first film experience in being on film and doing martial arts was at the age of in between 16 and 17 on the original Karate Kid. That gave me the bug and I was determined to go into film. So I rushed through graduating college, got my degree in commercial design and art illustration and minored in film and just rushed through and got it done and was on a plane out to California. I did a lot of training and a lot of meeting up with stunt teams and film groups and eventually wiggled my way into the film industry, working very hard at it. And at the same time, I was still pursuing martial arts, but my focus had really turned on to period historical swordsmanship. I had seen stage combat, I had seen SCA and other reenactments, and I understood that the love was there and that the interest was there. But at the time, I really felt like a lot of that was going in the wrong direction because there was syllabus and knowledge that was lacking. People were kind of coming to their own summations and their own ideas, and they didn't really have academia to back it up. So that's where you had a lot of things happen where to this day, people will say Florentine style when they mean the use of 2 weapons, which is absolutely a made-up term from the Renaissance festivals where somebody picked a book, and I can't remember the exact name of the book, but it was a book on swordsmanship. It showed somebody holding a case of rapiers, and it said, a man from Florence. And all that technically meant was an Italian swordsman holding 2 rapiers. But all of a sudden out of that came Florentine style, which is in no way, shape, or form a historical term. But the connection was made. Everybody who knows the story knows kind of more or less where it came from now. And they're kind of sympathetic to it and they don't bag on it too much. But I was trying at that time very, very hard to study more along the lines of Preston trying to find out about historical swordsmanship, which at the time was immensely difficult because there were very few people doing it. And so even finding recreations of period swords was immensely difficult. Oskar Kolumbatovich, who was the director of the opera in New York, and I believe also somewhere in Europe, had made reproductions of period swords. And a lot of people know his work. A lot of it was brass hilted, but it was one of the only commercial sword lines for purchase that were much closer to period accurate swords. He was the only person at that time making commercial reproductions of rapiers. So they weren't epee bladed cup hilts. They were actual rapier bladed, 1.25 inch wide blades, 38, 39 inches long with a real swept hilt on them, trying to be made after period rapiers. So I bought up as many of those as I could. I worked as hard as I could to find people that were like-minded who had studied, so that we were trying our best to make sure that we weren't doing stage combat. Because at a very, very early point, too early for most people, I knew that what stage combat was reproducing wasn't period swordsmanship. I knew in terms of a safety factor, rapier had to be copied after more modern sports saber play, and that everybody was cutting instead of thrusting. But at the time, it made perfect sense because it was much safer and much faster for actors to learn. And a lot of it came out of the British Vaudeville Society, and even earlier than that with the Shakespeare plays, where someone had to find a way to choreograph the plays with swords. And so, paralleling me working in the film industry and still trying to study as much period swordsmanship as I could, I had at one point gone off to Japan to study Japanese swordsmanship because I got involved in a kendo group in New York, and it was inordinately expensive. And I knew right away, this isn't real Japanese swordsmanship. This is sport fencing with shinai. And so when I went off to Japan, I was fortunate enough to find 2 instructors who brought me in as uchideshi, which was live-in student. And I was shown and taught Yagyu Shinkage Ryu and Musando. But I wasn't officially a student because I was Hagujin. I was a white student. So they wouldn't acknowledge me as a formal student, and they wouldn't formally give me any rankings. But because I had a certain amount of knowledge, they were interested enough to teach me. So for about 9 months, I was in Japan at 2 different times learning these different systems. Fully fascinated. It was immensely hard work because, I got the snot smacked out of me with a wooden bokken for months and months just for the pleasure of the instructors. I wasn't officially allowed to call them sensei. There was a lot of grumbling and barking, very much like in an old martial arts movie. But I was there to put up with all of it because I wanted the knowledge. And after studying as far as I could, which was roughly the equivalent of a black belt degree, after having studied 9-10 months, I was told, you have the knowledge now, don't disgrace it. You're never allowed to repeat my name as your sensei, because I wasn't. But you have to uphold what you've learned, keep it in your memory, but don't commercialize it. And I promised to do that. I came back to the States, traveled to Europe to try and find sword instructors in Europe, found a number of recreationists that were also trying to do period swordsmanship. And at the same time that I was trying to keep on my film career, I was avidly looking for people to study with who had the same minded goal of wanting to study real period swordsmanship and not what everybody was doing, which was a strange version of stage combat. And to nobody's fault, the information and the access to things really was immensely hard to come by at that time. You would go to museum exhibits and they would admire your love for the subject matter, but it was always very limited in terms of what they could let you in on, because most of the time the curators at smaller museums had an overview of everything, but almost all of the time there was no one there that was a period sword specialist at all. They had a generalized knowledge of arms and armor and could hit a number of key historical facts, but they didn't have in-depth knowledge. So you got to see and handle a bunch of real period swords, but there wasn't really much more in depth besides that. So I just kept trudging along and was fortunate enough to get on the film Hook, directed by Steven Spielberg. And I was brought onto that by Dan and Jan Bryant and Dan Speaker. And they were sword choreographers at that time in the early 90s. And they had worked very, very hard on their own syllabus and were very deeply into swordsmanship. And I worked with them for a long time and had a very, very good relationship with them. And, you know, part of that was being fortunate enough to get onto Hook. And it was a great experience. All of the old sort of fun Hollywood things happened. And, you know, we actually got to do cutlass play and such, but, you know, it was a Hollywood film. And right after that, I was fortunate enough to jump onto Dracula, Francis Ford Coppola's Dracula with Gary Oldman. And from that period on, my film career, I was lucky enough to get on film after film after film and break into stunts in television and smaller movies. And that became my career. And then on the side, I was avidly, ferociously studying period sword. And so between Japanese swordsmanship, Chinese, and European swordsmanship, I was really trying to amass as much real, actual knowledge as I could. And so those two things went hand in hand. I became a fight choreographer. I had an adamant desire to, in my own fight choreography, do things that weren't made up. I wanted to try and relay real period sword fights into movies as much as I would ever get the chance to. And in small instances, I did get a chance to do period recreation sword fights on television and things where I was lucky enough to be able to sneak in some actual historical technique and not get caught up in always being demanded to do Errol Flynn type sword fights. And it just sort of went steadily on there through the 90s and the 2000s. And I eventually studied with a number of other people who I held in high regard. And at the time, Western martial arts had sort of come up. HEMA did not exist yet. HEMA was not a thing yet. It was normally historical European martial arts, but it was just called Western martial arts for the most part. And I continued my study of Japanese swordsmanship along with all of the European swordplay I was doing. And so eventually got a number of rankings in Japanese swordsmanship, and I'm still studying today. But those two things sort of went hand in hand in terms of my film career and working very, very hard at studying with dozens of people and eventually becoming an instructor myself in only the things that I felt that I knew enough about. If it was something and somebody said, I want to learn Shamshir, I would go, at the time, I'd say, I have no idea. I know nothing of Shamshir swordsmanship. I'm not going to make up a bunch of garbage and say I'm teaching you something. So I tried to be intellectually honest over my entire career in terms of anything that I'd learned or hadn't known about. If I was going to delve into something, I wanted to learn what it really was and not a strange approximation of it. But there you go. That kind of roughly brings us up to present.
I'm sorry, did you say something, Luke? Could you repeat yourself? No. One, you've touched on a pretty long film career, which is funny because I know you from your work as a sword designer, which is like kind of, I guess, like, you know, knowing somebody who has a pretty devoted and illustrious career in one thing for like kind of a side hustle that they do. I just looked at the IMDb thing. I was like, oh, what movies? And I was like, oh, that's a lot.
Yeah, it's 120 films.
So Just because it's of interest. I have a whole bunch of questions uh, about the difference between swordsmanship, because you have this like academic background, you have a practical background, and also then you have the translation to film. And so having all three of those at the same time to a high degree is a pretty uncommon thing. So the first question though is just seeing the background of films that you've done. I'm curious, like what is there one in particular that you're proud of, and by contrast, is there one, you know, sword fight that you've choreographed or been involved in that you wish you could do again? Or like what are you
Oh
most
God,
proud of, and what do you wish, like, oh, nobody,
a lot of
wish they
them.
pulled my credit?
A lot of them. You're always striving to improve, and I in conversations I've been brutal about choreography that I don't agree with and such, but I have to be intellectually honest in being able to admit that when you're on a film, everything that can go wrong will go wrong. And executive producers and directors and people will demand the silliest stuff and the worst stuff you could possibly imagine. And you wind up having to incorporate it into the going, oh my God, this isn't my idea. It's totally wrong. This weapon wasn't used this way. And having to make a dozen excuses after the fact. There are a couple of projects. I was asked to come up with a realistic lightsaber duel by Corridor Digital. And Corridor Digital has a very, very big online presence in terms of being a computer effects group that also does their own content. They're brilliant, brilliant young guys. I push on them all the time to make their own movies. And, you know, they've had their ups and downs and bad experiences with Hollywood. And I'm sitting there going, but you don't understand. For 30 years, for 40 years, I didn't have any sort of access to even dream about being able to make my own short project or my creative things that were boiling inside me. And you guys have amassed so much knowledge and you have so much skill that in the blink of an eye, if you chose to, they could do their own version of recreating a lot of the Ray Harryhausen effects. And going into fantasy worlds that blend swordsmanship and creatures and fantasy, they have the ability to do that. And the little kid in me is always like, why aren't you doing this all day long? Why are you doing this other comedic video that is not really stretching you designing this 8-armed creature that's doing all these fantastical things with other guys jumping around it using swords? And they're like, well, that's not everything that a computer effects house does. And they have their own ideas and their own designs. But I did a project for them where they asked me to recreate and do a realistic lightsaber fight. What would a realistic lightsaber fight look like if two people were using these weapons and they were really trying to kill each other and you took a lot of the flashy Hollywoodness of it out? I'm very, very proud of that project and that choreography because I really feel like I was able to voice myself within that project in terms of what the fight is, the choreography, the story it tells. I'm very happy with how this turned out. And it took a lot of work. I was very hard on the two performers. They're both good friends of mine. They're both brilliant performers, but I just barked at them and barked at them and barked at them and made them do the fight over and over and over again because I didn't want any affectations. I didn't even want any stuntman movement. I didn't want any flourishes. I didn't want any jockeying or cockiness. I wanted two guys with deadly plasma blades who knew that they could kill each other at any moment.
Yeah, I'm playing it in the like on the screen at the moment. And it is certainly a different lightsaber fight. Somebody in the comments mentioned, by the way, the lightsaber fight and said that they were chef's kiss, chef's kiss, that it was pretty well done. So that's the one that you're proud of. And I think that was like the first time when that came out, it kind of went a little bit viral. And I recall you talking about it and saying, hey, this was the goal. I think you kind of hit the nail on the head. That remains one of the most fun lightsaber fights, especially since, I don't want to start a ruckus, but like I'm not as much a fan of some of the lightsaber work in the most recent films. I don't know that I'm going to surprise anyone or alone in that one though. But what about things that, oh yeah, I might have taken on too much too soon, or things that just didn't go the way you wanted for a number of reasons? What do you look back on your career and say, that one was a bag of shit?
Circumstances were it's hard because I always give 300% whenever I'm doing anything. I don't want to admit defeat. There were a number of films that I worked on where even on full film features or short films, there were instances where I did a film called Little Boy, and it was a movie, and I believe it was done in 2012 or 2013, and it was a film production that was filming in Mexico, and it was the story of a little boy whose father had been drafted into World War II, and he desperately wanted to get his father back safely from the war, and it dealt with magic and the will of his heart to bring his dad home safe. But secondarily, within that story, it was a story of tolerance, because there was a Japanese American character in the film who was being bullied. And the priest in the film tells the young boy, all right, as your penance for misbehaving, you have to go make friends with Mr. Hashimoto, and you've got to do things with him. You have to spend time with him. And the little boy's very upset about this. And he goes and he does it. And at some point in the story, because little boy is very little, he's a short kid, he's unusually short, and he's very self-conscious about it. And the character in the story tells him a beautiful thing. He says, don't measure yourself from the top down to the ground. Measure yourself from your feet up to the sky. And it's a beautiful moment. And he tells him the story of this servant to a Japanese samurai lord, and how there is this story about this group of samurai who have to fight the Mongols. And the Mongols are defeated the first time, and the Mongols return a second time. And there is a sort of a fantasy made up what if fight between a Mongolian champion who's almost not human and these samurai. And they are soundly defeated because this guy is like Goliath, and his master makes this, honorable, triumphant try, but is defeated and killed. And the servant, determined to avenge his master, takes up the sword. And he winds up in the same vein as Goliath, outwitting this giant warrior and spitting what's basically a scorpion's stinger into the giant warrior's neck, killing him with poison. And the idea of David and Goliath, where someone's not measured by their actual height, but by how large their spirit is. That sequence was very hard to shoot because it had been handled by a number of different people. The entire sequence had been given to me initially. And I trained 2 actors for a month and a half in Japanese swordsmanship, entirely traditional, taught them everything, taught them all of their kamae, showed them forms, worked on their footwork, got these 2 to look like 2 actual real samurai. And at the last minute, they recast both of them on a whim. And I had traveled to Mexico, and the production team told me, oh, no, that's not who's playing the samurai anymore. And I'm in a massive panic going, what? I trained those guys forever. They were perfect. What? Oh, well, the director wanted somebody with long hair. I'm like, why didn't you just put a wig on them? Logic being thrown out the window in the film industry. What happened, happened. And I suddenly found myself. Now, luckily, I pulled one of the Japanese stuntmen that I had gotten hired on the film. And I pulled him at the last minute and said, this is your other samurai because he's brilliant. He's an amazing Japanese stuntman and he knows swordsmanship. You've got to use him. And they said, yes. The other guy was a Japanese American rock band member who knew nothing about Japanese culture, nothing about the samurai, nothing traditional Japanese. And I had to, in a matter of 3 days, bring this guy up to speed and find a way to make him look like a period samurai. It was nightmarish in the beginning because he didn't understand. And, I found him sleeping in his trailer. And here's this, whiter than white guy barking at him in half Japanese going, do you want your entire family to watch this movie and see how disgraceful a job you do? And they're going to be family members in Japan that are watching you do this horribly and disgracing your own Japanese culture. And he's kind of looking at me getting all teary-eyed. And I'm like, I want what's best for you. And you're never going to get a second chance at this. Once this is incorporated, once this is put on film, it's forever. So if it's bad and your cousins make fun of you for the next 30 years, it's your own fault. And all of a sudden he kind of knuckled down and got with it. And I had a brilliant second unit director. I'm blanking on his name right now. It'll come to me. But he was in charge of the action and had gone over some of the choreography with me and, was picking camera angles. And he knew that I knew my subject matter. So he was very hard on me. It was Brad Allen, who has passed away. And Brad Allen was an original member of Jackie Chan's stunt team. And Brad Allen did a number of movies, like he did the choreography for Kick-Ass, and a number of other big action films. And he was an absolute brilliant choreographer. He choreographed the fights for Hellboy 2. Brilliant fight choreographer. I loved him to death. But he had been raised in Hong Kong cinema. So he was very harsh and really hard. And I remember him barking at me because he knew that I knew better about certain things. And because of Hollywood being Hollywood, I was like, well, they're going to change this anyway, so I should just leave it as. And he barked at me and he was like, it's wrong, fix it. And he kind of reinvigorated no, I've got to do it right no matter what. And if I can fight against Hollywood doing it wrong, I should. So we diligently worked on this scene. The sad thing is the scene was wound up being much shorter than it should have been. It's still a very good scene. It's still well done, but it was about a third less than what it should have been. And that was a project, even though the final result I'm proud of, and it's very good, I felt like we could have done a better job. I felt like between the communication problems and the time, that if there hadn't been those Hollywood snafus, we would have produced a higher quality product with more actual period action in it. But as is, I'm still proud of it. It's still a good job. I just know that we could have done better.
Yeah, I get what you're saying. There's working with a person for so many months only to kind of have that person moved off the project and to start over again and then hope for the best, also have your time cut. All of that sounds like a tale of wasted potential. And I can't blame you for putting that at the, if I could do it again, maybe. It does bring into question, though. It seems like so often I do study a variety of different traditional swordsmanship, and movies tend to, make it fun, but also like screw it up, right? And there's just so much that seems to get missed in so many Hollywood sword fights. Why is there such a gap between the way sword fights work and what I think could be most practitioners would argue, I guess anyway, could be fun and like entertaining on screen, but it ends up being, sword wiggle stick on camera instead. How come?
Um,
Why is there such a disparity?
there's a very specific reason, and I can break it down so that hopefully everybody kind of gets this. Um, there's a lack of knowledge because it's not really a director or producer's job to know every historical fact about whatever it was. And if I'm going to be blunt, there are a lot of people whose honest to God education level stopped at ninth grade. And in terms of what they remember from school, it's about a ninth grade level. And you're sitting down and you're discussing the film, and you start getting things like, well, yeah, the knights, medieval knight, their swords weighed about 12 pounds, right? And you're just going, no. Like, yeah, and they bash each other in the armor, right? And I'm like, no, they didn't do that. They didn't sit there and hammer on each other with swords because it was pointless. That was the point of plate armor. It was the pinnacle of the design at the time, and nobody bothered smacking each other with swords when they were in full plate armor. If I had a mace, if I had an axe, if I had something that was a can opener, I'd use that against you in your armor. But there's such a huge disparity between the story you're trying to tell in a movie and the research that people are willing to do. So the unfortunate thing is, because movies before the movie you're working on also got it wrong, you get numbers of department heads like costumers, prop people, even stunt performers who are telling you things, and you're going, no, no, no. You saw that in a movie in the 1970s. That's entirely historically inaccurate. They didn't do this. They didn't do that. People didn't twirl their damn swords around. People didn't spin in sword fights. It's like, let me explain something to you. And I've taken stunt guys before and gone, great, you have a sword, I have a sword. Now do a cool twist, spinny, twirly thing. And I whack them in the back of the head with the sword. And they're like, ow. And I'm like, that's why you don't spin and give your opponent your back. Would you do that in a gunfight? Well, no. Why the hell would you do it in a sword fight? Well, because it looks cool. Right, but it's still dumb. And anybody with any education, the movie's now ruined for them. And all you had to do was not do a dumb spin. There are a million historical period moves that you can do without flipping and spinning for no reason that are still exciting, that make sense when two people are trying to kill each other with swords. So it really boils down to, like, I'll give you an example of another one that went right. I was fortunate enough to be on Master and Commander, and I was hired by the stunt coordinator at the time to train people for all of the unarmed combat, all of the on deck knife fights, any sailors or British sailors and French privateers that were brawling on the deck of the ship. And I took everybody through a training regimen that was a combination of things. Because I said, look, there's no manual for this. At the time, period-wise, there was no manual made for swordsmanship at sea. If you were an officer and a gentleman, you were trained outside of the military in swordsmanship. You might have had some training in the military, but you would have spent your own money with a sword master as a gentleman to be trained in the art of the sword. Poor deckhands, pirates, privateers, regular sailors had none of this training. So on that film, we had to, again, Dan Speaker was the swordmaster on the film, and Jan Bryant was working with him. I was given a couple of sections of fights in the film to choreograph, and I did my absolute best to choreograph something that was absolutely as realistic as possible. Very violent, very bloody, very sloppy, very much, opportunities in the moment. You're there under deck in crowded situations trying to kill each other. Everybody was very happy with the pieces, but the reason that movie worked was because we had tons of historical advisors on that film. We had people that wanted to do it right. Dan Speaker knew his subject matter. Jan knew her subject matter. I knew my subject matter. And so we didn't put anything Hollywood-ish in there. It's the same when they had the firearms instructor. It's the same when they had the maritime historian who talked about all the sailing, all the rigging, everything. We had so many experts, and the experts trained everybody diligently. So the end result of that film is that Master and Commander is probably one of the most historically accurate British maritime films ever made. And
It was a fun movie.
most people who really know that historical subject matter will admit to you, yeah, that's my favorite movie because they did everything right. But it was massive amounts of work. I mean, we were on that film for about 5 months.
It's interesting you mentioned that one. Again, I'll admit to coming into this conversation with, distinguishing asshole in the ground, didn't know this side of you, Mr. Fontaine. So you're talking about all these movies, but Master and Commander is one that sticks out in my mind as a great old time. I really enjoyed that movie. The sword work doesn't come out or stand, it's not like The Princess Bride where there's this like sword scene that everyone remembers, but as just a general film, I remember enjoying it quite a lot. It stands out as one of the you're right, more historically accurate, or at least nothing like breaks your suspension of disbelief kind of thing. It was
right. And
that was a solid film.
There are some very, very good sword moments in the film, but nothing really stands out because it's all blended into real combat. So it feels like a battle. It feels like a brawl. There's no two people suddenly having this, duel in rhyme on the top of the ship.
Is there, speaking of places that did it well, if I separate out anything that you've personally worked on, so you can remove your bias, right? Is there anything that comes to mind as like a couple quick favorites of sword play on screen that you think just is really top notch?
Yeah, there are moments. There are moments, even if it's not the entire piece of choreography. There are moments in a number of films. There are some brilliant moments in Richard Lester's The Three and Four Musketeers, which were shot. It was shot as one film in 1973, but it was cut apart into The Three and Four Musketeers. There are a number of moments in the sword fights in that film that are very genuine, that feel like a real sword fight. Another one, hands down, would be Ridley Scott's The Duelists.
Yeah.
It's a very, very well done. He was one of the first people to blend the choreography with camera work to really make you feel the points of the swords. And in his shooting very shaky close-up over the shoulder shots, he made you feel the terror of being in a duel where somebody's going to thrust 2 feet of sharpened steel into your chest. He did a great job.
There was a scene with a guy he had his like shoulder flap coming off.
It's the saber duel, and he just gets this winged cut and cuts this big chunk that doesn't completely come off his shoulder. And that's really the type of thing that would happen in sword fights. Sword fights realistically wouldn't be that long. They would if you incorporated the preamble, if you incorporated the moment when both swords are drawn and there's a lot of gesturing and figuring out and tactics. No one's touched blades yet, but a minute and a half has gone by. That's where a sword fight might be longer. And there are historical accounts, like there's an account in Hyde Park where 2 gentlemen got entirely out of control and it turned into a brawl and they grabbed each other's blades and they were cut and punctured everywhere. And the seconds couldn't stop them. The seconds couldn't get in there to break it up. So it turned into this brawling, bloody mess with swords. So there were longer fights, but I like fights that are more realistic where there's something at stake. And there are moments of Rob Roy with Liam Neeson and Tim Roth. There are moments in that film that are very good. The entire choreography I don't agree with because there are a number of mistakes. When Tim Roth is driving Rob Roy across the floor and he's thrusting at him, he never took into account how tall Liam Neeson was. So Tim is literally thrusting at his knees, which wouldn't make any sense because that's nowhere near as much of a threat. In the choreography, they didn't stop and go, you've got to change the angle. You've got to raise your sword up like 4 inches. You're not going after his torso. You're not trying to stick him through the liver or the heart. You're going after his knees because he's so tall. We've got to redo that. And so, and there were things like that. There was a little too much cutting because Tim Roth was using a very late period transitional rapier, which would have been a fairly narrow blade. And although it would have had a diamond cross section, that sword wouldn't cut you to ribbons. It would cut you, but it wouldn't cut you badly. It wouldn't cut you as badly as he gets cut in the movie. And the deadliness of that sword is the point. The thing that makes you nervous is not, oh, I get a cut along my ribs or my forearm. It means nothing in a sword fight. You can continue the sword fight with 6, 7, 8 cuts on you, but puncture wounds are a whole different story. If I run a sword through your liver, oh, you don't want a sword fight anymore. So there were odd things in the film that I felt were moments where the film dropped in terms of the logic of the fight and the choreography. But again, I wasn't there. I have no idea all the difficulties they were dealing with. So even though I didn't agree with things, I can't judge because I have no idea how hard that was to put on film. And I wasn't in the choreographer's shoes, who was also a
I know you're not trying to throw shade. I just things
right.
that stand out. Those are some memorable moments, though. Rob Roy had a particular. I mean, the cleave right down like through the clavicle.
That's a great genuine moment. That's a moment that is a truth. It shows you the kind of damage you can have done to you by a large, heavy, sharp sword. And I love things like that because there's a dramatic weight to them. So now all of a sudden you're taking the sword fight seriously. It's not 2 guys going ting, 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 ting and smiling at each other. It's a sword fight where 2 people are trying to kill each other, and it has weight, and it makes the audience go, oh shit.
That's fair. So moving away from kind of the film side of things, one thing you did not mention too much in your explanation, you focused on I suppose what your actual job is, which is being, film sword master extraordinaire, but you also design swords, and that is where I know you from. Could you talk a little bit about the swords you've designed over time, what models people that collect and have used swords might recognize your handiwork in?
Yeah, I got very lucky in being able to get connected with Cold Steel and Lynn Thompson, who's the president of Cold Steel. And Lynn Thompson's an amazingly dedicated fellow because he has a love of swords and knives, and it shows in what he's done over the years, taking a company from nothing, from zero, and making it a multi-million-dollar company. He started it entirely on his own and built it up into one of the giants in the knife and sword industry. And when I got there, there had been a design propensity to make the swords bigger and heavier because the idea was that modern people are bigger. People in the 21st century are bigger and stronger than somebody would have been in the 16th century. So I'm like, okay, I can see the logic in that, but a number of these swords are not functioning the way they should because the size and the balance is off. And so what we started doing when Lynn actually gave me the job of being the head of the sword department, that was my only job, was working on the swords. I started, 1, to design new swords, but 2, I started working on the existing swords to change the proportions and the weights. So I worked very hard on a lot of the katanas to bring the weight down significantly and the proportions so that you had a sword that was 8 to 10 ounces less, that moved more properly like a Japanese sword should. And even though there were robust katanas at the time, and Japanese swords have their periods where they get heavier and lighter, I felt like there wasn't enough of a sampling of live, fast swords that moved the way they should. So Lynn agreed to work on changing the proportions and the weights of a lot of the swords. And we got a lot of the weights of a lot of the swords down. And at the same time, I was designing new swords for Cold Steel. I had designed the Hungarian saber as my design. And that sword, I'm very pleased with how that sword turned out. We had to send one prototype back, and I said, you've got to make the whole saber lighter. And they did. And it's a brilliant saber, and I'm really proud of it. And I'm very proud that they stuck with all of my complicated period designs. The scabbard on that sword was a nightmare for them to make, but I was adamant that I wanted to recreate a real decorated Hungarian saber scabbard. So that sword turned out great. I also designed the Mitsutori katana. And the Mitsutori, for some people don't know, it's the crane katana in Cold Steel's lineup, and it has the brown silk wrap.
So this is the Hungarian saber. I've not ever seen one of these guys in person. Let me find the Hitsutori.
Yeah, it's Mitsutori with an M. It's their crane katana.
I'll try katana. It's M-I-Z. Come on. There we go. Another one I have not had the pleasure of playing with.
And that sword, I'm very proud of that sword. That sword took almost 5 years to come to fruition because, very rightly so, Lynn Thompson was concerned with making a strong, durable sword for the money. So he wasn't really interested in doing differentially tempered traditional swords because he knew that they could bend. And Lynn wanted his customers to get the most for their money. So Lynn had spring tempered his Japanese swords so that they'd be a lot tougher and they would put up with a lot more abuse. Entirely valid. Totally understand why he did it. On top of which, there are a lot of people that have used Cold Steel katanas and still have them today because they were made with that spring temper. They're super tough and their blades are still with them. I really pushed to make a traditional Japanese sword, and we did. I'm really proud of it. It's made out of T10 steel, which is, a steel out of China that's very strong. And we've cut through a lot of crazy stuff with that sword. We cut through a Yeti cooler with that katana. And now we always reiterate that it constitutes gross abuse. And we do our best to tell everybody, look, I know this looks like fun, but we're professionally doing this to prove a point. We're exaggerating. We're going above and beyond. You should not do this because it's dangerous. And no sword is indestructible. I don't care who makes it. There's no such thing as an indestructible sword. I've seen you break swords. I know that even if it's a well-made sword, if you take a sword to destruction, it's going to break, period. You're absolutely going to find a way to break a sword. And you can be the first one to admit, now look, this sword would never come under this abuse. Even if this sword was in the middle of horrendous combat, it wouldn't have taken stress from this direction in this way with this thing to have been broken this way. But the purpose of taking it to destruction is to show the extent of what the actual made sword can put up with. So that if you knew that if you were going to try and break a sword, well, it's going to take you this much, so maybe it's not worth it. As well as all of the safety conditions with the idea of 2 feet of broken sharp blade flying through the air.
Yeah, helicopter of doom. Not a fun one. Have there been times in your testing and that you've had swords break, or in the film, just any funny stories of swords not doing sword jobs?
Yeah, we've had. I mean, we've done testing at Cold Steel and we've had swords break and it's been dramatic. We had a cutlass blade break once, and go right up over somebody's head. Um, we had a great sword break once where the blade spun and stuck in the wall. But again, we were over abusing these swords, and the very funny thing and the odd thing is that everybody at Cold Steel, or the group of us that were always handling the swords, had so much experience with swords that it really wasn't anything for us to dodge a blade. Something would break, we'd hear that ping, we knew it was coming, we'd move and it would go past us, and everybody would think that we were ninjas. It was like, no, we've been around swords enough to know that, one, this is possible, two, it happens, and three, you've got to keep your head on a swivel all the time. It's odd. I've had swords break on movies. It was always operator error. It was almost never the fault of the sword. It was somebody doing something with the sword that you absolutely shouldn't do. There was a sword broke on a hook because we were using an inordinately expensive Oscar Kolumbatovich Holy Schmart. And the sword was made to period specs for a period small sword. So it was a Holy Schmart that had the widened fort, and it went down to a small sword blade. But that blade had been tempered by Kolumbatovich like a real small sword blade, which would be a higher, harder temper. It's an absolute a fallacy that when you see old movies and people take the blade and bend it, that was something from the 1920s and 30s when somebody was a foil fencer and they wanted their blade to slightly curve in towards their opponent. If you were right-handed, went like this, and you got that slight curve on a fencing foil back in your opponent. No one ever did that, to my knowledge, that I've read about with period sword blades, because period sword blades were tempered harder to go through a person. And all the period European swords that I've ever tested, they don't flex anywhere near what you think a sword would flex. I've handled rapiers that barely flexed at all, as well as one or two small swords where the tip had already broken and the blade had been resharpened. So it was a less fine point, so they didn't mind my flex testing the blade. But they were the first one to admit to me that 2.5 inches of the blade had already broken off. So with things like that, you'll have blade breakages, but they can happen for a number of different reasons. I would say that in actual combat, more blades broke than bent. Lesser grade swords, munition grade swords, might have bent because they might have had a much less fine temper. So you might find munitions grade swords handed out to foot soldiers that might have bent, whereas a finer grade, more expensive sword, one, either would last a lot longer and the knight was much more skilled to not break his own blade, but if something were to really come across, the blade would break rather than bend.
We have a question here. What do you think the best steel is for a katana?
That is an insanely difficult question because of all of the different forging techniques. You have tamahagane. Okay, I have a Japanese sword. I have a sword that's tamahagane steel, and it's layered in sandwich steel. That sword that I have is so insanely sharp that I don't have to put any effort besides a very basic cut. And you know what I mean when I say basic cut. I'm talking about a starting out student that's going to do their first couple of cuts on tatami. I don't have to put any more effort than that into it for it to just collide right through a piece of tatami, even double rolled mats. And that sword it's a work of art. But with so many different techniques, and the thing is, we have modern steels now. T10 out of China is a very good steel. And when it's forged out properly, I've got a couple of those Mitsutores that are indestructible. I've got a couple of those crane katanas that I've cut through oversized piece of bamboo that I shouldn't cut through. You know, the Japanese etiquette in terms of the size of a piece of bamboo you should cut through. I've purposely gone beyond that to something with a thicker wall that was bigger, still cut through it with ease. And then the temptation, again, in terms of your formal training, is to be respectful and follow the guidelines and not act like a teenager and not whack your sword against trees or whatever, but finding out that the sword has an ability above and beyond what it would be called for is a nice surprise. But T10, I found that the T10 steel out of China, when it is forged correctly, is a very, very strong steel. And it puts up with a lot. And it will flex, and it will give without breaking, and it holds a pretty good edge. There are a number of other steels that I've heard a lot about, like L6 and other super steels that apparently also do well. There are things like knife steels like 3V and things like that. And the stories I've heard about those are, it's an immensely tough steel, but when it comes to sword length, they will more likely break than another steel because the strength factor really only has a certain length. You know, you can go up to about, I want to say 18 inches and have a 3V blade that's insanely strong, that stays sharp. But you go beyond that length and you go to something that's 25, 26 inches, you're upping the risk factor for stress fractures and breakage because you're now asking too much of the steel. And so 5160 has always been a pretty good sword steel. 1095 and 1085, they're not terrible steels for a sword blade. It really depends what you're going to do with the sword. If it's something that's going to be a hard use sword and you're going to cut with it every week and you're going to take it to competitions internationally to cut with that sword, it better be a better steel. It better be a better steel. I'm all for blended steels, Damascus blades, blending two steels so that one steel handles one part of the blade, another handles the other. So when you put them together, you get a beautiful combination of strength and flexibility so that the sword's durable enough, but it'll still flex and it has the properties that you want. But it's really hard with a lot of the modern steels. I would say that it was hard. I know that I would give new steels more of a chance because I have enough reference to people that would tell me these are the strengths and weaknesses of this steel. It's going to handle better this way. It's going to do this under these circumstances. So I have not seen anything yet majorly wrong with T10 unless it's lazily forged out. I had a sword once and it was forged out and the tang still had a teeny bit of temper to it unnecessarily, and there was a tiny stress fracture and it broke at that stress fracture. But that stress fracture had been there and they knew about it and they tried to pass the sword on anyway. So things like that, those are also circumstantial. If you're going to do your sleuthing, you're going to do your Sherlock Holmes bit about why a sword broke or where a sword was weaker or stronger. One of the things that really breaks my heart is a lot of the art has been lost. You look at period rapier blades, we can't reproduce that. We just can't. If you look at a blade that's 46 inches long and the ricasso section of the blade is half-inch thick steel and then goes down to a point that's almost nothing. You can't feel the weight of the overall blade. It's still light as a feather in your hand. And even though the overall weight is heavy, the blade is balanced so perfectly that the weight doesn't bother you. We've lost that art. There are a number of swordsmiths that get close, but I have not handled a modern rapier yet that had a perfect period balance the same as a late 16th century or early 17th century sword. Doesn't mean it doesn't exist. Doesn't mean somebody hasn't made it. I just haven't been fortunate enough yet to handle one. But as far as my knowledge goes, it seems like a lot of that art has been lost.
That's fair. I can't really critique on the rapier side of things. I have some experience with other styles of swords, but rapiers and gladius are there's a few styles of swords out there that I have just a lot less exposure to. Rapiers seem to be one that are just not as widely reproduced. I mean, there absolutely are some. It's not that you have to really hunt to find a reproduction, but to your point, a really accurate piece that captures the spirit of a historical piece. I don't know, and I've held out of. There's a lot of different sword types out there. Rapiers seem to be one that are less accessible in terms of antiques. I've had historical pieces from other cultures. I've gotten the chance through museums to hold and play with some other medieval artifacts, but I haven't gotten a chance to really, be handsy with a lot of rapiers. So
it's difficult because they're clumped in certain places. Period rapiers aren't everywhere. You can find them. There's a couple places here in California that have some very good examples. They are not cheap. That is the one thing that's really heartbreaking when it comes to antique rapiers, antique small swords. You can find some beautiful examples, but they are not cheap. You've got to save up a bunch of money for those.
When you talk about sword designing, I asked you a similar question in your film career. Is there one that you're proud of? Is there one that you would like to revisit? I'd ask you the same one about your sword designing experience. Is there one that you're particularly proud of that you're like, yeah, put this in the ground with me? Likewise, is there one that you would like to revisit and redo if you could?
I'm actually really proud of the sword that I just designed that just came out, and I have it with me. And it's the Italian storta. Now, storta is a 16th century Italian, usually single hand saber that is more or less based off of the medieval falchion. When you look at a lot of period art sources, a lot of people will say that storta may have had a lot of Middle Eastern influence. It's very possible, but usually those samples are only seen in paintings and not so much in actual antique pieces. This piece that I created is based off of 3 different swords that are all real existing swords. And I chose to extend the handle a little bit more so that this could barely be used in either 1 or 2 hands. The handle is only about 7.5, 8 inches long. So for somebody with very large hands, it's a single hand sword and a bit, but I wanted to make something that somebody could, if they wanted to use it for competition cutting, they could use it with 1 or 2 hands. The blade design is replicated from different actual Italian stortas in museum collections. The blade runs about 26 inches long. The whole sword is 36 inches long. Everything on it is based off of something that's actually existed in the period. I know that I'm going to get griping about the handle length, but I've already found 2 examples, one of an Italian saber from the 16th century that's got a grip longer than this, And two, I found a storta that had a slightly longer grip. So again, when we're trying not to talk in terms of absolutes, none of us are 500 years old. It doesn't make sense to say they never made a sword like that. And you go, out of the hundreds of thousands of swords that were made, you're going to tell me you know all of them and that they never made that sword? I'll bet against that. But it gives room. It gives room for designs that lend towards certain things. I could have made this sword with a single hand grip and it would have been 150% historically accurate, but the number of different ways in which you could have used it would have been very limited. It would have been a single hand chopper. And in making the grip slightly longer and paying attention to other period examples that I found, I made it so that you can put two hands on this grip and cut with it two hands as if it was a two-handed sword. Now, with a blade that's only 26 inches, this sword cuts really well. And it's very fast in the hand. And martially, what I'm proud of is that this sword makes a hell of a lot of sense. Nobody's going to pick up this sword and go, oh, I don't want to fight with this. You know, in terms of the period, you go, well, if I'm going to sit here and split hairs about historical, this grip shouldn't be longer than 6.5 inches, blah, blah, blah. So, yeah, but pick the thing up and feel it. Tell me that you wouldn't fight with that sword. You're going to tell me you wouldn't use it. And that's one of my other goals is that, again, trying to adhere to, if I'm reproducing something historically accurate, I want the sword to feel right. It's got to feel right. It's got to move like an actual fighting sword. I don't make wall hangers. I don't design wall hangers. I'm not a fan of wall hangers. I love real swords. And a big goal of mine is in designing a new sword, I want that sword to work. I want that sword to float in your hand. And with production manufactured swords, everybody's got to understand that you can't control the quality 200%. So you are going to get better and worse balanced swords out of 600 pieces that are made. All 600 pieces are not going to have a balance point right here. It's just, it's impossible. It doesn't happen that way. The same way in history, if you had munitions grade weapons that were made for a castle, I guarantee you the weights were all over the map. I guarantee you there was some big, huge guy who went, I like this big, heavy sword. Give me this. And there was some little 5'8" snazzy swordsman who went, nope, I want this light one. And so on and so forth. So I'm really proud of this sword. I think aesthetically it turned out beautifully. And it still is of the period, but it holds all of the characteristics that I feel a storta should. Storta were beautiful swords. A lot of them were severely decorated and had multiple fullers and all kinds of creative designs and beautiful handles and, you know, jewel encrusted and gold encrusted hilts. A lot of them were amazing pieces of art. I wanted to put enough into this, but still make sure it was functional. There's a lot of detail in the hilt. Yeah. You know, there's a lot of nice things going on, but at the same time, it's functional. So whenever you design a sword, everything can go wrong or everything can go right. In this case, everything went right. And I'm very happy with having a produced sword that when you pick it up, you go, I want to use this sword. Because now I win. I actually made something that is functional, is beautiful, can be used, can be looked at, can be admired. But if it needed to come under use, it can cut.
So the storta seems like it stands out as one that you're proud of, and I'm very happy to hear that there's an example out there that just you pick it up and it feels intuitive and it makes you smile and want to use it. I'll admit I've had a number of cold steel swords over the years, and the weight and feeling like that exact thing that you're talking about feels like something that's been lacking from a number of the swords that I've had the chance to play with.
The transition at Cold Steel, I want to say it only really happened in the last 8 to 10 years. But in the last 8 to 10 years, significant changes were made in the balance and weights of a lot of the swords. And, you know, I would hard press it against anybody to say, well, go pick up that sword from 1990 or go pick up that sword from 1999 and now handle this sword from 2003. And the difference is night and day. And we worked really hard on that. You know, Lynn Thompson was very amicable and very patient in terms of his study of swordsmanship and his knowledge, and agreeing, okay, when I was strong as a bull and could whip around a 10-pound sword, I might have this sword that's 4 pounds that doesn't need to be 4 pounds. But Lynn was so damn strong, it didn't feel heavy to him. And I would pick it up and go, oh my God, I can't use this. So he was very open to look at the other side of things. And because of that, we got a lot of swords that came out that were of superior quality and amazing feel and balance and cut very, very well. It's just, I think that a lot of people don't know it because there are a number of people that haven't purchased newer cold steel swords to feel the difference. Like if anybody were to buy our Hungarian saber, I have yet to hear one complaint about that sword. Everyone that's handled it says, wow, it's fast, it's light, it's stiff, it cuts like a demon. But we put a lot of work into that sword. You know, I had to do 2 prototypes and I had to change a whole bunch of things, and I had other people helping me. A lot of effort went into that. You know, it wasn't, it's the same thing. I'll show you another sword.
You can check back in the comment section in a week or so. If anyone has a complaint, I'm sure they won't be shy in the comments section.
Oh, I'm sure they won't. But I have a feeling that a lot of the complaints are going to be about some sword that they're not remembering that they bought in 1997. This is our Roman Gladius. I worked hard on this sword too. When this sword was initially made, Lynn didn't like it. It was heavy. There really wasn't anything special about it. There were a number of things that Lynn, rightfully so, wasn't happy about, as well as Lynn said, look, this sword was used in tandem with a scutum. It was used with a shield. So it feels really weird to me to make a Roman Gladius and not make a shield. But I don't want to make shields. Those shields are huge. They'll be a shipping nightmare. And I couldn't do anything but agree with them. And eventually I said, Lynn, it doesn't matter. It's not our job to provide a scutum. People can go buy a shield from wherever they want. It doesn't mean that maybe we shouldn't make a nice Roman Gladius. And what happened was I went to China and I pushed on the maker there to do a better job. I said, the sword's too long. It's almost 23 inches long. That's too long for a Gladius. I want you to shorten it to 19.5 inches. I want it a lot lighter. I want the cross section of the diamond of the blade to be thinner. It's too thick. And I want some changes. So I changed the decoration on the sword, and I changed the decoration on the pommel. The pommel had this very weird, anachronistic, modern pattern to it, so I had him change it. But this sword is just under 2 pounds and moves the way a stiff Gladius should. So we don't have period examples of Gladius in perfect condition that aren't rusted or aged to know exactly what it was. But me holding this sword and knowing how it was used, I can use this sword. It's not unwieldy. The tip is thick enough. It doesn't have a thin, brittle tip. The grind is really, really well done. The scabbard has got beautiful decorations and is a very, very high quality. So this is another sword that when I designed this sword, I was very, very happy with how this sword turned out, because this is a sword that's worth the money. It's high quality. It's very well made. It balances well in the hand, and you are absolutely getting what you're paying for when you get this sword. You're not getting a crappy sword.
Are there swords that, if there was an appetite for the market, if you could sell them, that you would love to make, but there just isn't an interest in the market today?
In the back of my mind, I still want to make a really nice Swiss saber.
Everyone says that, but nobody makes one.
Well, but I'm going to tell you why. I already have a design. I know exactly what my Swiss saber looks like. It's beautiful. It's got lions' heads on it. It's sexy as hell. It's very difficult to make because a Swiss saber is a certain length. The grip is a certain length. The whole sword, it's as long as a long sword. Maybe an Italian longsword, not a German longsword, but it's still a long sword. And without people having a true knowledge of what the sword is, you now have a marketing problem. If you're going to make 500 of these swords, you want to sell 500 of these swords. And if you make them and you only sell 20, and the end of the year comes and you're like, hey, we sold 25 out of 500 of these swords, I don't think this is a hit. Now you have to validate the sword you've made. And you have to sit there and say, well, look, it's going to catch on. I will do publicity for it. I know how to advertise it. I know how to feature it. I didn't guarantee that, this sword was going to sell out in 10 minutes. But I think that with the right combination, I can get that sword made and have it be a hit, because to the untrained eye, you've got a big curved katana with a swept hilt guard on it. So imagine having a big katana with hand protection, like unlimited hand protection. You got a big knuckle bow, you got all these bars protecting your hand, and you've got a big curved blade. So if you put a swept hilt on your favorite katana, if you were going to mash up two swords and you went, this is my favorite katana, now I've got a swept hilt protecting both my hands, I'm a little cocky now. I feel a little better because you're not going to cut my hands off.
It's just interesting that pretty universally, this is not a question I suppose I ask of everyone, but when there's a sword manufacturer or a person that makes swords, and I say, like, what would you really like to make, or what do you think doesn't get attention? Pretty universally, the Swiss saber is right at the top of the list of things that just are awesome, but don't receive the same kind of praise or interest that other swords do. And so I with it, enough people seem to really love them that make them. I think that could translate. And now, since I guess I don't know if it's quite the same, but the Wheel of Time is supposed to be based on, like, the swords sound more like Swiss sabers to me than than what they made them out to be in the show. But
right.
Now might be the time for people that are really itching to have a little bit more accurate Wheel of Time saber, which is more akin to a Swiss saber. Anyway, yeah, I'm all for it. That sounds awesome.
Yeah, I think really what it comes down to is you've got to make something, and this is the holy grail. You've got to make something that's strong, beautiful, floats in the hand, but is reasonably priced. That's sort of the holy grail, and that's the nightmare, because you make something, it's amazing, it's got an incredible temper, you can cut through half of a tree with it, it's God level, but you're going, I have to charge $1,300 for this sword. I can't charge $600 for this sword. The amount that went into it, the steel, everything else, in order to make a profit, I've got to sell this sword at $1,300. Not too many people are going to jump on the bandwagon to buy a $1,300 sword. People save up for Albions because they're beautiful pieces. And Albion, I know the guys at Albion, and they're great people. Mike Sigmund and everybody. They make an amazing product, but they're also backlogged. They've also got orders going back who knows how long.
And they don't make Swiss sabers.
Yep. And but they also know, if you ask Mike Sigmund, he go, I don't want to make a Swiss saber. That's a huge headache, because the minute you start talking about a steel swept tilt guard, in terms of manufacturing, you want to cast that swept tilt out of good quality steel in parts and weld it together. You don't have the time as a manufacturer to weld up out of separate bars each and every swept tilt. You would just get backlogged for the rest of your life. And so you can make an incredibly strong steel swept tilt out of steel castings and weld it together. But to get a manufacturer to agree that that's a good idea in terms of the amount of labor compared to the cost, it's an uphill battle. It's really not easy. And that's why with a number of things, I don't push. I don't push. I don't sit there and go, well, you have to, the other thing that I really want to make that is doable.
I think you're right is the point, Luke.
Yeah.
I think you're right on this one. I've had a few of these, online conversations with folks, and I remember the first time a Swiss Saber came up, and I was like, yeah, that is a really pretty sword I want to play with. And I've heard it over and over and over again, though, that man, this is one of the most underrepresented categories of sword. It's beautiful. It's familiar. It has features that people like. It has elegance that resonates with people. And at the same time, they probably feel quite comfortable in the hand. So I think you're right. I think the Swiss Saber, you could be the wave of change we need here. More Swiss Sabers.
Well, if I can unlock the code for making something that's strong and sexy looking and usable, and I can have it come in at $4.99, then we will have hit it out of the park, and you'll see Swiss Sabers being made. But from now until whenever that is, it's going to be an uphill battle.
I don't, with the price of, provided it's well done, right? And that's I suppose the caveat. I think you've probably had swords that are, you look at them and you're like, we really nailed this one. And you've had some others that say, the variation, it's good for the money, but you want a rock star all the way around. You want something that I'm sure is just, it's fun to say, you'd be stupid not to buy this. This is an amazing sword. It's not about the money. It's just an amazing sword. And it also happens to be cheap. I think you can get away with a little bit more, though. The market seems to have an appetite for some more expensive swords. There's a sweet spot, certainly, but I hear pretty frequently that people are selling swords that are more expensive, particularly in the HEMA realm of things. There's an underserved community of people, because you have in the Japanese sword realm, if you want a sword for $70 or you want a sword for $70,000, there's a sword for you. They take care of all kinds at every level, every dollar value that you can consider.
Yep.
There's some option available for you, but it's not necessarily the same way in the European sphere. You have some, kind of entry level products, some stuff in China that is, maybe questionable, some stuff that may be less questionable, some more well-known manufacturers of repute. And then, in the rapier category, Arms and Armor kind of stands apart in the realm of people that do a little bit more bespoke kind of hand work, fiddly work. And then maybe custom smiths that are charging you really, a ton of money, but there's not it's a little bit more jagged in terms of the step. I think there's an appetite for people to spend a few $1,000s on a sword if it's worth the money.
I think so also. I'm going to be blunt about this. One of the major problems is that the community won't take into account that they're absolutely expecting too much from a sword for the money. They'll get a sword for $500 and want it to work and move and behave above an Albion, which is absurd. And there is a level of, I don't want to say spoiled, because I don't think that's the right word, because I don't think people are spoiled, but I think people absolutely have absolutely have unrealistic expectations of what a sword in a price range should do. If you, in a period sense, were a man of war and you went and had a sword commissioned, you know that sword's going to be expensive. They're not making you a sword for the equivalent of $400.
Mm-hmm.
Your sword is going to be closer to 20 or 30 grand because that sword is life or death for you. And it's not unreasonable to spend 20 or 30 grand on your primary weapon, on the thing that you're going to have on the battlefield day in and day out. People want a Lamborghini for the price of a Toyota, and it's wholly just not fair, and it's not a realistic expectation at all. I hear criticisms of swords being made, and I'm just like, are you out of your mind? You're criticizing that $400 or $500 sword like it's a $2,000 piece, and you can't sit there and go, I want my Toyota to be a Lamborghini. That makes sense, right? Nobody would look at a Toyota and go, why isn't it a Lamborghini? But for some reason, they'll do it with swords.
You would be wrong, but you could say that. You can absolutely.
And so it's unless, because the other thing is the community has to continue to grow in terms of their knowledge of sword making. It's not just about, I can use this sword really well, I win tons of tournaments, I'm really good at handling a sword. Great, nobody cares. What do you know about how that sword was made? What do you know about the value of that sword? What do you know about how difficult that sword is to make, what goes into it, what you're purchasing, what your investment is? So there's a lack of knowledge, and people are getting more now, but it's an investment. It's an investment. You don't just run out and buy any car. You do your research. What do I want? I want a Subaru over Toyota. I want this. You do your research in terms of what has a good track record, what are closer to indestructible cars. Well, it's got to be the same thing with swords. And so if you need a replacement learning semi-beater sword, you're going to be between $200 and $500. And at the $500 range, it's going to be less of a beater, and you're going to give it more respect, and you're going to take care of it. But there are levels to the. So I own 4 storage containers full of swords. My collection, I have thousands of swords in my collection, and I've been buying them since I was. I've been buying them since I was 16 years old, and I have swords that are no longer made. I have swords that are crafted by custom sword makers who are no longer alive. I'm very fortunate to have hunted down and gotten dozens and dozens and dozens of incredible swords. But I understood the investment I was making. I understood the value of a good sword. And when I don't want to say haphazardly, but when you get into swordsmanship and your love of swords in more of a juvenile way, and you come up from that, and you start to get interested in HEMA, and you start to go and study and train. But before that, you had a very childish knowledge of swords. You went out and you got a $100 sword, and you went out in your backyard and you smacked it against a tree for 6 hours until it bent. As you learn more, your knowledge and your appreciation of the tool has to come up as well. You can't look at your sword and somebody go, tell me about your sword. It's a this. Who made it? What kind of steel is it made out of? Was it forged? Is it stock removal? Was it mass assembled? Was it made by hand? Was it made by somebody in Poland? Was it made by somebody in the US? Was it made by somebody in China? All of those things are factors. And I'm a strong believer in that anything you buy should have a value. I have never, in over 40 years, broken a sword blade that I didn't intentionally break for a test. But in using and fencing and sword fighting, I've never broken a blade. There's no need to, because if you break your tool, you're dead on the battlefield, right? So there's a level of appreciation. You're not going to take your brand new Lamborghini and drive it into a tree. It's the exact same thing with every sword you own. Everything you own, you worked for the money, you saved the money, you purchased this thing. They all have some kind of intrinsic value and memory to you. So unless it's, some crappy wall hanger that you re-welded back in the 80s, everything that you get should have a purpose and a value. So
you've got a vendetta against trees, Mr. Fontaine.
I just find, listen, I got to tell you, in my working at Cold Steel, I had to be a forensic genius and bust a lot of guys who called me up wanting new swords, and me going, no, I got your katana back. It stank of creosote. You went out in the middle of dead of winter. You already admitted to me you live in Wisconsin. You went out in the dead of winter, below freezing temperatures, and smacked your katana into this telephone pole until it shattered. You don't get a new sword. You're not a monkey. It's not an axe. An axe is for chopping into wood. A sword is for chopping into people. We're not really killing anybody now, but we have to respect what the use of a sword is. Swords are made for killing people. We no longer kill people with swords. But if we're going to recreate that, we can't smack our swords into trees for any reason, because it's like taking your Lamborghini and crashing it into a tree to see how it does. It's the exact same thing. So when people, I had guys spend $1,000 on a sword, call me up, whining and bitching, and I went, did you take your brand new car and drive it into a tree to see how it would hold up? No. Why'd you do it with your expensive sword? That's $1,000. You might as well just throw that out the window. What did you think the sword was going to do? A tree is an immovable object, just like anything else. If I hit a person with a sword, they move, which takes a lot of the percussive energy out of the cut, which takes a lot of stress off the sword. A tree's not moving. A tree's going to stand there and go, hit me again and watch me break your blade. So, but the thing is, as young men, I swear to God, the first thing you're going to do is go out and hit a tree, because a tree
the next opportunity
is kind of the size of a person.
You should maybe make the tree killer, the cold steel designated clubbish axe sword.
It would, it'd basically be a long axe.
But you're touching on something interesting, and I know we're we chat a lot about swords. We're probably should wind down here, but I do have a couple more questions I'd like to ask you to indulge. And you're touching on one of them here, which is what should people know about swords that they just don't? You've got a lot of experience with cold steel and customer service and making swords and getting feedback. What do you wish people knew about swords before they bought one?
Swords are really not easy to make. They're really not easy to mass produce. If I have a swordsmith and I go to him and it's a friend of mine and I say, make me this sword, make it out of this steel, I want the handle like this, that one swordsmith making one sword is going to be able to take all of your wants into consideration, where the balance point is, the type of grind, the handle length, how it should feel, all of those things, how the blade tapers, how it distal tapers. That's an ability, and that's something that somebody can do because you're going to a custom craftsperson. When you're making swords, production swords en masse, you have to remember they're making 500 and 600 of something. So that sword gets put into the forge, they heat it up, they hammer it, they shape it, they let it cool, they finish it, they sharpen it. You have people working on sword assembly lines. Some of them know swords, some of them just know the job they're doing. So we've made this beautiful sword. It's straight as an arrow. It's tempered perfectly. And we give it to the guy to polish, and he puts big gloves on and takes that blade and shoves it into the wheel and leaves it on the wheel and pulls all the temper out of the blade in 3 or 4 spots. So now this sword that we made that was amazing has now got no temper in 3 or 4 spots, what happens? Those are the 3 or 4 spots where the sword bends. And somebody that paid all this money for this sword is like, this thing's a piece of crap. I used it twice and it bent. There were 600 other swords made like yours. And unfortunately, if the quality control wasn't there, you got that crappy tempered sword. And hopefully the company replaces your sword immediately. But mass manufacturing swords is really not easy, because you've got to remember they have to pay somebody. I have a company that I might be doing this for now. I may have to go in and do inspections on their sword shipments. That takes all day. It means that I've got to inspect 1,000 to 2,000 swords, and I've got to inspect each one for temper, sharpness, quality control, fitment of the hilt, tight fittings, good balance, all of those things. A number of them are going to fail. A number of them, I'm going to say, this doesn't have the right temper. This blade is cupped. This blade is dull. It happens. And all you can do is do the best you can to up the quality control as you move forward. The other thing is, swords are meant for a certain purpose. And you guys, as everybody is learning, every weapon has a purpose. An axe has a purpose. A mace has a purpose. A ball and chain has a purpose. A sword has a purpose. A great sword has a purpose. A spear has a purpose. Because swords are most common, don't take your sword that you were massively excited and you waited months to get, and it's now in your hands and it's beautifully crafted. Do not take that sword out and start hacking into hard objects. Period swordsman. If there was a knight, if there were 2 16th century knights and they faced off, that knight did not pull his sword and start smacking the other knight in armor, because his sword would get ruined and the other knight is laughing at him. He took that sword, he half-sworded it and stuck it into the other guy's armpit or his eye slot or the backs of his knees. He used the sword the way it should be used against somebody in full armor. Your sword will last you your entire life if you use it right. It's my God, it's terrible. It's like don't abuse your swords. Love your swords. Treat your swords right.
Treat your swords right.
Mainly because the excitement you have when you pull the sword out of the box and you look at it, and yay, praise be to God, it's a beautifully made sword. You got 1 out of 500 swords where it's razor sharp, perfectly straight, beautiful grinds, beautiful details, floats in your hand. Take care of that. Take care of that sword. Imagine you're in the middle of the apocalypse, you don't have any firearms, and this sword is the only thing that's going to save you from monsters. You've got to take care of that sword. So that sword will last you 30 years, and you'll have all kinds of awesome stories to tell about it and how much you love it if you take care of it. So take care of your swords. If you're going to spar with them, you're going to buy a sword for sparring. You're going to buy a sword with thickened edges. You're going to buy, something that is a trainer and not a cutting sword. So you understand the difference between the two. And that way, everything you buy, 90% of it you'll love, because you haven't taken it and put it in the wrong vein and damaged it unnecessarily. It's things serve a purpose. You know what I mean? Go buy tatami mats, go get water bottles, go get things that you can cut so you can see how badass your sword is and how sharp it is and how your technique is getting better, but you're not damaging your sword that you paid $1,000 for. Or you paid $500 for. It doesn't matter. It's your hard-earned money. None of us are making $1 billion right now. So if you put $500 into something, take care of it. They will last you. And, if something is faulty and it does half fall apart in your hands, that's not your fault. And you should be able to send that back to the manufacturer, and they should be able to replace that sword. But take care of your tools. Because if you take care of your tools. I mean, everybody listening here, and this conversation we're having is about the fact that we all love swords. So the only thing I can say, like Happy Santa Claus is take care of your
Love your
presents,
sword.
take care of your swords.
So the last question, Joe, I have, and I'll turn it over to you for more stuff to talk about. But what I haven't mentioned before in this stream is one of the way I think we actually started having conversations, Luke, was you chimed in the comments section and on a video, and that started a conversation between us.
Yes.
And it was about a review I had done some time ago, and it's a testament actually to that, like, positivity can come from the comment section. It's not all insults and you know, shenanigans in there. You made a comment, we started a conversation, and you've been very generous with your time and knowledge since then. But as a guy who makes sword reviews on the internet, not necessarily about me, but as the internet sword culture in general, what do you think reviewers miss about cold steel, about swords in general? Do you have any feedback on things you would like to see to make them more valuable to you?
Just the sword community in general. Look at the other side of the picture. It's very hard to make swords. When somebody like me designs swords for you guys, I generally have your best interest at heart. I want to make a sword that you go apeshit over when you take it out of the box. And I want it to feel of value, and I want you to swing it around, and I want you to be excited like a kid on Christmas morning. Just remember, I don't personally have control over the manufacture of 600 swords. So in going through them and doing quality control, people are human. Nobody is trying to rip you off and give you a shitty sword. So that's the most important thing to remember in terms of anger and being pissed off and saying so-and-so swords suck and da-da-da. Well, you got one bad sword. You didn't get 600 bad swords. So cut people a break, give them the chance to make it right. And if they send you a brand new sword and it's amazing, job done. But in terms of the community, we all study. We all have an interest and a love of swords. Let's try our best to give each other less shit, because we all have a common thing. We all love the same thing. Nobody, if you're sitting there going, I love katanas, hey man, I love katanas. Or I love rapiers, I love rapiers. You see that sword in that movie? Oh my God, that's my favorite movie. You have more things in common than you don't. So I know it's funny to get on the internet and razz and do things, but at some point, just try to bring the community together more, because we all have a common goal. And I'm going to be the first damn person to say I'm opinionated as hell. I'll be the first person to say that. And I'll admit it, because I'm going to be intellectually honest. Because if we're not intellectually honest, we have nothing. We have to have adult conversations. I'm opinionated as shit. And can I be wrong? Yes, I can. I'm human. So within the community, let's just try to be more of a community and pay attention to the fact that we all love swords and we all love swordsmanship, over who's better, who knows more, who's more of a badass. Let's try to put that on the back burner, because, again, ego and machismo in swordsmanship is the first thing that would get you killed on the battlefield. I'm the baddest. Well, 2 seconds later, somebody stuck a spear in your back and you're dead. Now your swordsmanship skills mean nothing. So let's all get along more. More positive comments, more positive suggestions. If you got the crappiest sword in history, how can it be fixed? How can we fix it? How can we help you? You know, if you tell me you got a crappy sword from Cold Steel and you just got it last week, of course I'm going to try and help you. I don't work with the company fully 24 hours a day anymore, but I know the people at GSM, and I can try to help you get your problem resolved, so that if you did get a crappy sword, hopefully I can help get it replaced and you get a great sword and you love it. But us being more sympathetic and bonding together is going to result in a lot more cool stuff than us grumbling and giving each other crap and making fun of each other and just battling on the internet. I know it's fun, because none of us really fight with swords anymore, and you can't go out to a HEMA tournament every single day, but we all love the same thing. We all have a common factor that binds us together as opposed to makes us sit there and fight. So my thing would be, let's all in fun, but when it's not in fun and it's malicious, let's try to give each other less crap.
That's a fair point. I not to say that I haven't been critical of Cold Steel stuff in the past, or sung its praises. There's a few that I do enjoy, and I tend to sing the praises where they're due. But a lot of that criticism comes from the desire to have cool things made, right? And I would agree that there does seem to be some every now and again some malicious intent where it's like you've made a mistake and we want you to die and suffer for eternity and go bankrupt and not be able to eat. No, I would love everyone to be able to make a living making swords, making cool stuff, and also to make really compelling, good products that people want and that serve them well. So the if you can push your criticism, your complaints, or your feedback to the things that are going to help a company do better, I think you end up with more competition, more good stuff, more compelling offerings out there to satiate your sword related needs.
If it's constructive criticism or something where you're able to voice absolutely specifically what it is, someone can help you. If you're just like, your swords are shit, they're heavy, I don't like them, they suck, die. What am I supposed to do with that? I'm not under any kind of obligation.
You're supposed to lighten the swords and die. Yeah, what do you mean?
I'm not under any kind of obligation to take your shit. So it's, again, it in speaking in absolutes, whether it's historical, general, social, when you speak in absolutes and you go, you suck. Well, now you just close the conversation off and there's nowhere to go from there. Because I can either say, oh, thanks for selling me, I suck, or no, you suck, or whatever. It closes things off. So and I'm not saying anybody is this. If you are a self-designated troll, what's wrong? If you want to get on the internet just to make everybody else miserable, something has to be lacking with you. You're not happy about something in your life if you're just getting on the internet to make other people miserable. I'm not a psychologist, but that's not bullshit. So trolls are going to exist, but we understand that there's something behind someone being a troll. Nobody is your psychiatrist. Nobody's your doctor. But if people are trying to go, hey, man, what's the real problem? Talk to me like a human being. Don't just shout at me and call me names. What went wrong? And if somebody's willing to open up a dialogue, talk to them about it, because none of us know everything. I'm not Mr. Super Duper Master. I'm still a student. I'm still learning. In terms of martial arts, I'm still learning. I'm never going to get it. I'm always going to find something new to learn. That keeps me humble. That keeps me safe. And it keeps me enjoying my art and learning. The minute I start going, you guys all suck and I'm a badass and I know everything, I've closed my mind off. Now I'm a jerk and nobody wants to talk to me. But I did that to myself. That's not anybody else's fault. So
this conversation is a great example of giving somebody the benefit of the doubt, Luke.
Yes.
I made a video about a thing. You probably poured energy and effort into it, and I was critical of it. You made a comment, and I asked you for more feedback to learn, and here we are sitting down having a conversation.
I mean, we've now had hours of meaningful conversation out of something that started from something else. So it's proof. It's 100% proof that this is the better route to take. It's like I'm saying, we all want to learn. And when we hear somebody's full story, we have a whole different understanding of what's going on. I'm the first one to say, in terms of the history of cold steel swords, they used to be thicker and heavier and less wieldable. But we've worked really hard on improving them. And I can pretty much guarantee you, if you pick up a sword that's been made in the last 5 or 6 years, it's going to handle completely differently. It's going to be lighter, faster, sharp, and a good sword. Now, the trick is everybody has their own taste and feel. Everybody goes, I want a lighter sword. I want a heavier. That's where custom swords come in. As Cold Steel, if I make and design a sword and they make 500 of it, I'm not going to be able to hit every single one of your personal bullet points because we're two entirely different people. That's where custom swords come in. That's where, dude, you can't really expect custom results out of a mass-produced $300 or $400 or $500 sword. But if it means enough to you, all it means is that you save more of your money, you save more of your money, you find a smith that you really like, they make you a custom sword, and now you love everything about that sword. The other thing is teach yourself swordsmithing. Teach yourself. I taught myself through other sword makers and other swordsmiths. I taught myself how to make my own blades. I can make a whole sword entirely by myself if I want to. If I want to forge out a blade and make a whole sword, I can. I'm not as good at it as other people, so I'd rather have somebody else do it for me. But I can do all my own repairs. I can do all of my own customizations. So if your only gripe about a sword is that it's slightly too heavy or you don't like the grip, you can go and learn from a number of people how to do basic grind work to very slowly take weight out of that blade without destroying the temper, repolishing the blade. Now you have a blade that's 5 ounces lighter and you love it. And that was the only thing you needed to change. Or you want to change the grip, or you want to do something with the guard. That's part of learning swordsmanship and about swords. It doesn't make sense to be nuts about swords and have absolutely no clue how to do your own repairs or how to take care of your own sword or your own sword customizations. You'll love your sword twice as much if you buy a sword, you customize it, you make it perfect for you, and then you also have the pride that you did it yourself. So somebody goes, hey, this is a so-and-so sword, but you've improved on it. Really nice custom work. Now you've got a sword you love and you got a bunch of compliments on top of it.
It's an interesting point, honestly, to say have some ability to do for yourself and make adjustments where the manufacturer might fall short in your personal estimation. I think there's a fair bit of criticism that I've rendered on companies for not providing sharp swords or not providing things that are tight, not from the standpoint of like, hey, you talked about cars earlier, right? You don't go and take your Lamborghini and wrap it around a tree. You don't have to go take your new sword and do the same thing either. There are people who are really handy with things and will take their brand new car. I've known a few of them that buy a brand new car, pull a bunch of stuff out of it and put a bunch of different new stuff in it and customize it to make it faster, agile, or look or change in some other way. But if the car doesn't like drive, you should expect it to, right? Like there are some things where I think there's a base level that you should be able to hit at the same time. I don't inherently disagree that if there are things that you don't like, you might be able to buy something from Cold Steel for $500, get yourself a grinder from Harbor Freight and some belts for $50, and you could have yourself a very fancy sword that you really, really love, instead of spending thousands of dollars on a custom piece to achieve the same kind of dynamic properties. That's not bad advice. I do think that it might give the manufacturer a little bit more license to suck than I would like.
Listen, here's the thing. I don't want to make a false pretense in terms of customizing your swords. In some extent, might take a fair amount of training. You might have to work on grinding and take a raw piece of steel and grind that raw piece of steel and go through your belt grits. So you learn how to start at a coarse grit, take it to a fine grit, then to a Scotch-Brite wheel, then to a polish. But it's something that's doable. You can learn that skill. It's not something that is tens of thousands of dollars and out of your reach. The same way, leather crafting, woodworking, learning how to use a torch, learning how to weld. There's a lot of things that you can do with a certain amount of training where you can literally do a lot of custom things to the sword you purchase to make it the exact sword you want, instead of waiting for us to build a whole new sword that's exactly what you want.
Somebody
I've had hundreds
a while ago that a lot of the greatest swords that you see in museums, the finest works of deadly art that are out there, were made from tools that were less robust than the $10 section at Home Depot, right? Like files and
Yeah,
the simple things, like there were very unsophisticated tools, but just a very, very talented craftsmen and a lot of trial and error that that
yeah,
were involved in making
invention.
some of these things.
Yeah, invention is another necessity. I mean, when you need something, you're going to find a way to invent it because you need it. I need a weapon to keep myself alive. You're going to wind up inventing some new variation of a weapon because it's something that you need, and you have to rely on it. It's not a toy. It's not something you're screwing around with. A lot of times, the firearm, all the things that were invented out of a necessity, and they only improved and progressed by a further need in terms of technology and what you were facing at the time. It's why a matchlock went to a full flintlock and then went to cartridges and went to a modern firearm that we have today. So, in terms of, you do have a lot of options. Like if I said, if you get a sword and things that you don't like about the sword, you can change things. Not everything, but you might be able to change the, you now have a piece that you. So it's the array of what is possible is wider than you think. And again, I'm not above accepting criticism. Nobody's perfect. You know, plenty of things that are made are not perfect. Somebody says, well, you know, you could have made this like this here. So yeah, I could have, but you have to remember, I'm making something that's going to be mass produced. I'm not making something that's a custom piece. If I were making a custom piece, I very well may make it in that fashion because I'm making one incredible sword that I can pay attention to and put hundreds of details in. You know, because when you put hundreds of details in a production sword, that price goes up and up and up. Because now I've got to have one guy forge it. I have to have somebody else grind it. I have to have somebody else put beautiful fullers into it by hand, not machine. I'm going to put those fullers into the blade by hand. And then I have to have somebody else who's going to polish the blade out and fit the sword together and get it to have a nice tight fit and make sure that the blade is straight. So when you go through all of those steps, it takes a lot to make a sword. So
Yeah, no,
again,
no argument.
nobody has the intention to make and sell you a crappy sword and steal your money. That's really anybody's intention. I'm not going to say there aren't people who don't make crappy swords out there. I've seen some pretty crappy swords, but you have to do your own research as well.
As long as the notion of the customizations and the skill to do that is used as a way for a buyer to enhance their experience and to take something that might not meet their needs, look at it as like, hey, if I develop the skill, is the juice worth the squeeze? There's a few folks making comments here that say like, hey, you know, it probably would be more effective to just buy a more expensive sword and save yourself the trouble of some of those customizations, but that it's not always the option. It's sometimes tough to achieve if you are knowledgeable and nerdy enough to know that like, hey, the cold steel Italian longsword is the right shape and size that I want, but it's too heavy. And you have some ability to mitigate the distal taper or to change around the grinding and get it exactly dialed in the way you want. That might be the best option as opposed to trying to find something, because there are a number of swords that don't have a bunch of options out there. There are in the katana space, but not necessarily in a lot of the European spaces. Anyway, Luke, I've chatted your ear off for the last 2 hours. Before we close things down here, though, I wanted to pass it over to you. Is there anything that you think in the sword conversation to people that collect that you want to chat about or needs to be said?
I'm really happy that so many more people have taken an interest in swords, because let me tell you, back in the 70s and 80s, I was considered a weirdo. You know,
You
when
still
we were
are,
back in the
but
70s and
you're one
80s,
of
you know,
us.
and then I'm like, yeah, well, so what if I am a weirdo? Who cares? I love swords. I like, you know, I'm enamored with the history and swords in general. But I like that so many more people have taken up an interest, that are opening books, that are teaching themselves things. Um, Again, you know, be kind to each other. Try to be kind to each other. You know, try not to speak in absolutes. You know, they never did this. They always did that. I try all the time not to do that because I'm not 600 years old and I can't tell you because I wasn't there. So people never did this with a sword. Yeah, but in this treatise right here, this guy's complaining about people doing it, which meant they were doing it. It might be wrong, but just in the treatise right here is proof that people were doing it. It's things like that. So I don't know, man. Spread love, not hate. You know, in terms of people's logic, like talking about, well, it might make sense to just get a better sword. You're not wrong, but some people might not be able to afford that. Some people might not be able to afford jumping up $300 to another sword, or they live in an area where it's going to be a nightmare for them to ship the sword they have back and order a whole new sword. Maybe that's going to be 6 months. And that 6 months, they won't have a sword, and they would rather try and do some modifications to the sword they have than have to wait all that time or wait all the time to earn that money. Um, we all we all have crosses to bear. We all have different financial situations. We all have different living situations. But if we all love swords, what I love to see is when people help each other out. That always makes me happy, man. If I go on a thread and I see 6 people giving references or help to somebody about a certain sword, that warms my heart because that's a community. That's some guy who's been dying for a certain type of sword. He hasn't been able to find it because his knowledge isn't there. And 5 or 6 people get on and direct him right to it. Now they've made that guy's day. It's a super cool thing. So, you know, again, we're all learning. We all have an interest. Um, you know, fun and
Yeah.
games and joking is all fair, but I don't know. Let's just try and enjoy what we love and be cooler to each other.
There are a fair number of people in this little niche hobby that seem to be out just to be right about a thing. But I would say that there's more of them that are very eager to share their knowledge and their time, and to make sure that people are having fun with the hobby. And Luke, you've been one of those folks for me. Like I said, our conversation started from a YouTube comment, and then you've been very generous with your time when I've asked you questions and whatnot. And you're a guy with other shit to do, so I've always appreciated it. So you're a man that is practicing what he preaches. You know what I mean? You're
I try.
open to feedback and willing to help us all learn a little bit. Anyway, I want to say thank you for your time. We should probably wind down here. It's been a couple hours. Thank you, Luke, for your time and joining
Sure.
the show. I
Thank
hope
you. Thank
everyone
you,
had
Matt,
fun
for
here.
taking the time and having me on. I really
All
appreciate
right.
it. Thank you.
I'll sign off here. Cheers, everyone. Thanks for keeping the chat lively.